The small town of Millbrook was about to experience its first federal raid in 50 years. Margaret Thompson was in her garden when the black SUVs arrived. She didn't run, didn't panic, didn't even seem surprised. She just stood up slowly, wiped the dirt from her hands, and said the words she hadn't spoken in 30 years. "I've been expecting you." Because some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. Margaret Thompson was everything a small American town expected from a 73-year-old grandmother. She had silver hair, always perfectly styled, wore sensible cardigans and soft pastels, and never missed Sunday service at Millbrook Methodist Church. Her house at 2047 Maple Street was the embodiment of suburban perfection, complete with a white picket fence, carefully tended rose garden, and an American flag that she replaced religiously every Independence Day. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? For 3 decades, Margaret had been the kind of neighbor everyone treasured. She baked apple pies for church fundraisers, volunteered at the local library reading stories to children, and knew the names of every dog on her street. During the harsh winters, she would shovel snow from elderly neighbors' walkways without being asked. In summer, her garden was a showcase that won the town's beautification award 7 years running. The people of Millbrook assumed Margaret had always been exactly what she appeared to be. She spoke with the faintest trace of an accent that she explained as the result of immigrant parents from Eastern Europe, though she rarely discussed her family background in detail. When pressed about her past, she would smile sweetly and redirect conversations toward community concerns or local gossip. What none of her neighbors knew was that Margaret Thompson was not her real name. She had not been born in America, had never had immigrant parents, and the gentle grandmother persona she projected was the most successful deep cover operation in espionage history. Margaret Thompson was actually Anna Volkov, a former KGB operative who had been trained in the most secretive programs of Soviet intelligence. Anna's story began in 1964 in a classified facility outside Moscow, where the Soviet Union was developing a new generation of intelligence officers for long-term infiltration missions in the United States. Unlike traditional spies who operated for months or years before extraction, these operatives were designed to disappear into American society for decades, building genuine lives while gathering intelligence and waiting for activation orders that might never come. Anna Volkov was selected for the program at age 19, chosen from thousands of candidates for her exceptional intelligence, emotional stability, and remarkable ability to absorb and replicate cultural behaviors. She spent 3 years in intensive training that transformed every aspect of her identity. She learned to speak English with perfect American regional accents, studied American history and pop culture with academic precision, and underwent psychological conditioning that allowed her to adopt American behavioral patterns so completely that they became second nature. The training went far beyond language and cultural education. Anna learned advanced techniques in surveillance, communication, and intelligence gathering. She was taught to build and maintain multiple false identities, to detect and evade counterintelligence operations, and to blend seamlessly into American social structures. Most importantly, she was trained to maintain her cover identity for indefinite periods, even when isolated from any contact with Soviet handlers. In 1967, Anna Volkov officially died in a training accident at a military facility near Stalingrad. The woman who had been Anna was given new identity documents, a fabricated personal history, and a mission briefing that would define the next phase of her life. She was now Elena Kozlov, a refugee from the Hungarian Revolution who had fled to Austria before eventually reaching the United States with assistance from Catholic relief organizations. Elena's entry into the United States was facilitated through networks that the KGB had been developing for years. Her documentation was perfect, created by master forgers and supported by records planted in refugee assistance organizations across Europe. She arrived in New York in late 1967, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and speaking broken English that concealed her perfect fluency. The first years in America were the most dangerous. Elena had to establish a genuine life while avoiding detection by American intelligence services that were actively searching for Soviet infiltrators. She worked minimum-wage jobs, lived in modest boarding houses, and gradually built the kind of unremarkable American existence that would make her invisible to surveillance. Elena's cover identity evolved carefully over several years. She worked as a seamstress in New York's garment district, attended English classes at a community college, and began developing relationships with other immigrants and working-class Americans. Every interaction was calculated to build her legend while gathering intelligence about American industrial capacity, social attitudes, and political developments. In 1972, Elena received her first operational assignment. Through a coded message hidden in a library book, she was instructed to relocate to the Midwest and establish herself in a smaller community where she could monitor agricultural production and industrial development while maintaining her cover as an ordinary immigrant seeking a better life in rural America. Elena chose Millbrook, Iowa, population 8,400, specifically because it was large enough to provide anonymity, but small enough that she could eventually know most of the residents personally. The town was surrounded by agricultural land and had two small manufacturing plants that produced components for military contractors. It was exactly the kind of location where a long-term intelligence asset could provide valuable information while remaining completely invisible. Elena rented a small apartment above a bakery and found work at the local diner, serving coffee and hamburgers to farmers and factory workers. She was quiet, polite, and hardworking, gradually earning the trust and affection of customers who began to think of her as a permanent part of the community. She attended church regularly, not out of religious conviction but because it was an excellent way to integrate into the social fabric of a small Midwestern town. The intelligence Elena gathered was not dramatic or immediately critical to Soviet operations. She reported on crop yields, factory production schedules, and the economic conditions affecting rural American communities. She documented changes in local attitudes toward government policies and international affairs. Her reports provided Soviet analysts with detailed insights into American agricultural and industrial capacity that helped inform larger strategic decisions. More importantly, Elena served as a sleeper agent who could be activated for specific missions if needed. Her deep integration into American society made her an ideal asset for operations that required someone with unquestioned American credentials and intimate knowledge of local customs and relationships. For 15 years, Elena Kozlov lived a carefully constructed life in Millbrook. She dated occasionally but never seriously, claiming that her work and community involvement kept her too busy for romantic relationships. She had friends but maintained enough emotional distance to protect her operational security. She was well-liked but not intimately known, trusted but not completely transparent. The end of the Cold War in 1989 created a crisis for deep-cover operatives like Elena. The Soviet Union that had trained and deployed her was collapsing, and the intelligence networks that supported her operations were being dismantled or compromised. Elena received fragmentary communications indicating that her handlers were no longer in position to provide guidance or support. Faced with the possibility that she might be identified and arrested as American counterintelligence services rolled up Soviet networks, Elena made a decision that violated her training but ensured her survival. She would disappear from her current identity and create a new life that had no connection to Soviet intelligence operations. Elena Kozlov died in a car accident on a remote highway in Nebraska in March 1994. The accident was staged carefully, with a body that could not be definitively identified and evidence that suggested she had been traveling alone to visit relatives in Colorado. Local authorities conducted a routine investigation but found no reason to suspect anything unusual about the death of a quiet immigrant woman with no known enemies or suspicious connections. 3 months later, Margaret Thompson appeared in Millbrook with a tragic story about losing her husband in the same accident that had claimed Elena Kozlov. Margaret was Elena's carefully crafted new identity, supported by forged documents and a plausible background that explained her presence in the community. She was a widow seeking a fresh start in a town where she had once visited friends, though those friends had conveniently moved away years earlier. Margaret purchased the house at 2047 Maple Street with cash, explaining that her deceased husband had left her a modest insurance settlement. She decorated the house in a style that was completely different from Elena's sparse apartment, surrounding herself with a kind of comfortable domesticity that suggested a woman who had always prioritized family and home over career ambitions. The transformation from Elena to Margaret involved more than changing names and addresses. Margaret was more outgoing than Elena had been, more involved in community activities, more willing to form close friendships. She seemed to have overcome whatever shyness or reserve had characterized her earlier years, blossoming into the kind of woman who naturally became a community leader. Margaret joined the church Elena had attended but became much more active in its social programs. She volunteered for charity drives, organized bake sales, and eventually joined the church board. She learned to play bridge and became part of a weekly group that met to play cards and share gossip. She developed a reputation as someone who could be counted on to help neighbors in times of crisis. The intelligence work ended completely with Margaret's emergence. She made no attempt to gather information for any foreign government and received no communications from former handlers. Margaret Thompson appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a widow building a new life based on genuine connections to her adopted community. For 30 years, Margaret maintained this identity without arousing any suspicion. She aged gracefully, developed the kind of minor health problems expected in elderly women, and gradually took on the role of community grandmother. Young families sought her advice on child rearing, teenagers confided in her about their problems, and local politicians consulted her on issues affecting elderly residents. Margaret's house became a center of community activity. She hosted holiday parties, organized neighborhood watch meetings, and opened her home to anyone who needed a place to talk through personal problems. Her kitchen was famous for its apple pies and chocolate chip cookies, recipes she claimed to have inherited from her mother, but had actually learned from a KGB training manual on American domestic customs. The investigation that eventually revealed Margaret's true identity began with a routine review of Cold War intelligence files that had been declassified for historical research. A retired CIA analyst named Robert Chen was researching Soviet infiltration operations for a book about intelligence activities during the night. Chen noticed discrepancies in several files related to deep-cover operatives who had disappeared during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Most sleeper agents had either been arrested, had defected openly, or had simply vanished without trace. But a few cases suggested operatives who might have successfully transitioned to new identities and remained undetected in American society. One file contained a partial description of an agent codenamed Gardner who had been deployed to the American Midwest in the early 90s. The file indicated that Gardner was a female operative trained for long-term integration into rural American communities, but most details about her identity and location had been redacted or lost. Chen cross-referenced the Gardner file with immigration records, death certificates, and other documents from the relevant time period. He discovered the curious case of Elena Kozlov, a woman who had lived in Millbrook for over 20 years before dying in a car accident, under circumstances that left several questions unanswered. Further investigation revealed that Elena Kozlov's background, while plausible, contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested professional forgery. Her immigration documentation was perfect, but records of her life in Europe before reaching America were surprisingly sparse. Her employment history in the United States showed a pattern of cash payments and minimal paperwork that avoided creating extensive bureaucratic trails. Most intriguingly, Chen discovered that Margaret Thompson had appeared in Millbrook just months after Elena Kozlov's death, with a personal history that placed her in the same community at the same time. The coincidence was remarkable, but Chen's intelligence background made him suspicious of remarkable coincidences. Chen spent 2 years developing evidence that Elena Kozlov and Margaret Thompson were the same person. He analyzed photographs, interviewed elderly residents who remembered both women, and traced financial records that showed suspicious patterns. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling enough to warrant official investigation. In early 2024, Chen presented his findings to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. The agents were initially skeptical that a Soviet spy could have remained undetected for over 30 years, particularly one who had become so integrated into American community life. But Chen's research was thorough and professional, and the implications were serious enough to justify further investigation. The FBI investigation began carefully, using surveillance techniques that would not alert Margaret to their interest. They monitored her communications, analyzed her financial records, and conducted background checks on her known associates. They found no evidence of current espionage activities or contact with foreign intelligence services. What they did find was a woman who had lived an exemplary American life for 3 decades. Margaret Thompson was beloved by her neighbors, respected by local officials, and trusted by everyone who knew her. She had no criminal record, no suspicious associations, and no apparent connection to any foreign government. But the technical evidence was undeniable. Facial recognition software confirmed that Alina Kozlov and Margaret Thompson were the same person. Fingerprint analysis of items from both identities matched perfectly. Most conclusively, surveillance of Margaret's house revealed that she maintained a hidden room in her basement, containing equipment and documents that could only have belonged to a trained intelligence operative. The FBI faced an unprecedented situation. They had identified a former Soviet spy who had been living peacefully in American society for decades, without apparently engaging in any intelligence activities. Margaret posed no obvious threat to national security, but her very existence raised questions about how many other deep-cover operatives might still be living undetected in American communities. The decision to arrest Margaret was made at the highest levels of the Justice Department. Even though she appeared to pose no current threat, her presence in the United States was illegal, and her possession of intelligence equipment suggested ongoing capabilities that could be activated by hostile foreign governments. The arrest was planned as a low-key operation that would minimize disruption to the Millbrook community. A small team of FBI agents would approach Margaret at her home, inform her that her identity had been discovered, and transport her to federal facilities for interrogation and processing. But when the black SUVs arrived at 2047 Maple Street on that quiet Tuesday morning, Margaret was ready for them. She had been expecting this moment for 30 years, knowing that eventually her past would catch up with her. She had lived every day with the knowledge that her carefully constructed life could end at any moment. Margaret's calm response to the FBI's arrival surprised the agents who had expected to find a dangerous spy ready to resist arrest or attempt escape. Instead, they found an elderly woman who seemed almost relieved that her decades of deception were finally over. She invited them into her home, offered them coffee, and began answering their questions with remarkable candor. The interrogation that followed revealed the full scope of Margaret's transformation from Soviet spy to American grandmother. She provided detailed information about her training, her original mission, and her decision to abandon intelligence work after the end of the Cold War. She also gave the FBI access to the hidden room in her basement, which contained enough evidence to rewrite understanding of Soviet deep-cover operations. Margaret's cooperation was motivated partly by pragmatism and partly by genuine affection for the community that had become her real home. She knew that resistance would be futile and would only create more problems for the neighbors who had trusted her for 30 years. She also recognized that her arrest would devastate people who had considered her family, and she wanted to minimize their pain by being as forthcoming as possible. The FBI investigation confirmed that Margaret had not engaged in any intelligence activities since creating her new identity in 19. She had severed all contact with former handlers, destroyed most of her espionage equipment, and made no attempt to gather or transmit information that could be useful to foreign governments. For all practical purposes, Anna Volkov had died when Margaret Thompson was born. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the unprecedented nature of Margaret's situation. She was clearly guilty of immigration fraud, identity theft, and possession of espionage equipment. But she had also lived as a model American citizen for 3 decades, contributing positively to her community and causing no harm to national security interests. Federal prosecutors ultimately decided to offer Margaret a plea agreement that acknowledged both her criminal history and her rehabilitation. She would plead guilty to relevant charges but receive a sentence that reflected her cooperation and the absence of any recent intelligence activities. The agreement also allowed her to remain in the United States under supervised probation rather than facing deportation to a Russia that no longer resembled the Soviet Union she had once served. The reaction in Millbrook was predictably complex. Many residents were shocked and hurt by the revelation that someone they had trusted completely had been deceiving them for 30 years. Others were fascinated by the idea that their quiet town had been home to a real-life spy. A few were angry that Margaret had put the community at risk by living there under false pretenses. But the predominant response was sadness for a woman who had clearly found genuine happiness in Millbrook, but could never fully belong there because of her deceptive past. Margaret had formed real friendships, contributed meaningfully to community life, and earned the respect and affection of people who had known her for decades. The revelation of her true identity didn't erase those relationships, but it fundamentally changed their nature. Margaret's sentencing hearing was attended by dozens of Millbrook residents who wanted to show support for the woman they had known as a friend and neighbor. Several people testified about her positive contributions to the community and her genuine care for others. The judge acknowledged that Margaret's case was unlike any other in American legal history and that her punishment should reflect both her crimes and her rehabilitation. Margaret received a sentence of 5 years probation, with the requirement that she continue cooperating with federal investigators studying Soviet deep cover operations. She was allowed to remain in her house on Maple Street, though she would be subject to regular monitoring and restrictions on her activities. Most importantly, she would be permitted to maintain the relationship she had built during her 30 years as Margaret Thompson. The aftermath of Margaret's exposure had lasting effects on the Millbrook community. Some residents felt betrayed by her deception and found it difficult to trust her despite her obvious care for the town. Others were impressed by her ability to maintain such a complete false identity while living a genuinely good life. The situation forced everyone to consider questions about identity, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Margaret herself seemed relieved to finally live without the burden of maintaining her cover identity. She could now acknowledge her true background, though she chose to share few details about her intelligence training or operations. She continued living in Millbrook, though her role in community activities was necessarily reduced due to the restrictions of her probation. The case attracted national media attention and sparked debates about immigration policy, national security, and the statute of limitations for espionage activities. Legal scholars argued about whether someone who had abandoned intelligence work for decades should face the same penalties as active spies. Intelligence professionals studied Margaret's case to understand how other deep cover operatives might be living undetected in American society. Margaret's story became a case study in the complexities of identity and belonging in modern society. She had genuinely become the person she pretended to be, transforming from a trained deceiver into someone whose care for others was authentic and profound. The community that had embraced her was forced to grapple with the question of whether her original deception negated the real relationship she had built over 3 decades. 2 years after her arrest, Margaret remained in Millbrook, though her life was necessarily different from the active community involvement she had enjoyed previously. She still attended church regularly, though she no longer served on committees or organized social events. Some neighbors continued to visit her regularly, while others maintained polite distance. The weekly bridge game continued, though with obvious tension that hadn't existed before. Margaret's case highlighted the human cost of intelligence work and the difficulty of truly leaving espionage careers behind. Even after 30 years of genuine civilian life, her past had caught up with her in ways that affected not just her own future but the lives of everyone who had considered her family. She had succeeded in creating a new identity so complete that it became her true self, but that success couldn't protect her from the consequences of her original deception. The FBI investigation that began with Margaret's arrest continued for years, identifying several other deep cover operatives who had similarly disappeared into American society after the end of the Cold War. Most had died of natural causes or accidents, but a few remained undetected, living lives that paralleled Margaret's experience of genuine integration into American communities. Margaret's cooperation with these ongoing investigations was comprehensive and valuable. Her insights into Soviet training methods and operational procedures helped intelligence professionals understand how deeply embedded foreign agents might be identified and approached. She also provided analysis of the psychological challenges faced by operatives attempting to abandon their intelligence careers and build genuine civilian lives. The town of Millbrook gradually adapted to having a former Soviet spy as a permanent resident. Margaret's house remained a landmark that drew occasional curious visitors, though most residents preferred to treat her as simply another elderly neighbor dealing with the restrictions of supervised probation. The community's response to her situation reflected broader American attitudes toward forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of genuine change. Margaret Thompson, formerly Anna Volkov, lived the remainder of her life in the town that had become her real home, surrounded by people who had learned to separate the woman they knew from the spy she had once been. Her story served as a reminder that identity is complex and mutable, that people can genuinely change, and that the most successful deceptions are sometimes the ones that become true. The secrets buried in small American towns are not always what they seem. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who have stopped being dangerous, and the most successful spies are those who have learned to spy on themselves, constantly monitoring their own behavior to ensure they remain the people they chose to become rather than the people they were trained to be. Margaret's legacy in Millbrook was complicated but ultimately positive. She had demonstrated that even the most elaborate deceptions could evolve into genuine relationships, and that communities could find ways to embrace people whose pasts were more complex than their presents suggested. Her story proved that 30 years is long enough to become someone new, even if it's not long enough to completely escape who you used to be.